we'd like to acknowledge the first farmers of the land on which this podcast was recorded.
And pay our respects to elders past and present who carry the land's history.
And to any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islanders listening today.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Full Bottle Podcast. I'm your host Gabby.
And I'm your host Matt, and we're recording this month's episode on Wurundjeri land here in Melbourne.
It's good to be back in the big smoke. I've assumed it would be freezing in Melbourne, but it's not. It's not too bad. I've left frost in Mildura, so...
Yeah, Gabby, I told you it's not all bad down here. You've actually been in Melbourne for a few days now, and it hasn't all been work. What are some of the other things you've done while you've been here in the big smoke?
I really like the bagels. There's like bagel shops here. I don't know, I think I must have been like in my 20s before I discovered what a bagel was. You know, you don't get them on the farm. So the bagel shop down Swanston Street and Brown Bagels just off Little Collins Street are amazing. You've not had a bagel until you've gone there.
What a sheltered life you lived before for so long there, Gabs, but it's
protected.
True. Yeah. It's very true. We're spoilt for choice when it comes to food down here in Melbourne. Have you hit up the Loon Bakery for a croissant yet?
No, that's on my list, although when I'm here, I'm obviously working, so I would have to take some time off to line up just to grab one.
That's true. It's a very popular spot.
But it's good to be recording face-to-face, and I have to admit, I absolutely threw Matt into the deep end last month for his first episode of the podcast, so... How are you feeling this month?
There's no denying you threw me in the deep end there, Gabby, but, well, I don't think I'll ever get used to hearing my voice on a podcast. I'm excited to be back for another episode of The Full Bottle this month. And I'll preface that by saying I'm pretty intrigued to see where our conversation goes this time around.
I put in some extra questions just to throw you off your game. Can't have you effortlessly end my continued reign of being the better host, you know?
Jeez, Gabs, it's only been a month and you're already getting stuck into me, but let's straighten up a little bit here. A moment ago, you were speaking about the weather here in Melbourne, and it got me thinking of our listeners out there and if any of them are actually having a warm winter or perhaps preparing for a potentially warmer summer with El Nino declared.
Yeah, I've heard a mix of weather stories from growers and how they're managing maybe some unpredictable climates. Send us a voice message through our socials or text us and let us know what kind of weather you're having and where you are in the world, and we'll play it in the next episode.
Yeah, it'd be great to get some chatter from our international listeners. Did you know about 15% of our listeners here on The Full Bottle are actually from the United States, listening in from California, New York, Colorado and Texas mostly?
That's a good segue into introducing this month's episode, where we get to talk to some attendees from the Biosecurity Study Tour in California and Florida in May this year.
This tour explored the US citrus industry and how they're managing exotic species and diseases like citrus canker and HLB.
You might be wondering, gee, what is this obsession with travel Citrus Australia seems to have? Well, the insight you gain through travel is invaluable. These overseas tours are eye-opening, and a lot of work goes into putting them together.
Yeah, that's for sure. Our hardworking citrus biosecurity manager, Jessica Lai, and the Citrus Watch program pulled this tour together with part funding from Plant Health Australia Levy.
A key part of biosecurity preparedness is education, learning about the biology and impact of these pest species before an incursion. It's an important part of building industry readiness.
You'll be hearing from Fresh Produce Group's horticultural technologist Tristan Smith. Now, you might recognise Tristan from the cover of the Vine magazine. He'll be giving us a nursery and analytical reflection on what he learnt on the tour.
We'll also be joined by Neutrino Produce Group Farm Manager for Abbotsleigh in Central Burnett, Queensland, Craig Estens. You might recognise him as the winner of our Easter Bingo competition this year. He's going to be giving us a very practical grower management perspective of the trip.
Now, both these guys love the numbers of growing and are incredibly keen on new ag technology out there. It should make for an interesting listen, so why don't we get into it, Gabs?
You. Hi Tristan, welcome to your debut on the Full Bottle Podcast. How does it feel?
Thanks for having me, Gabby. Yeah, it's great to be invited along to have a chat about this topic. You'll have to excuse my voice a little bit. I'm sorry. I have been recovering from a bit of a respiratory cold, so my vocal cords aren't what they normally are, unfortunately.
That's okay. So what does a horticultural technologist get up to on their day-to-day? What's the difference between an agronomist and a horticultural technologist?
The title horticultural technologist just means that I have to do the agronomy and any other thing that may come along my way. Essentially, for all intensive purposes, I am the agronomist for FPG on our East Coast operations in our table grapes and citrus operations based down in Sunraysia. But I also get involved in some of our third-party supply and some of our other aspects of the business as well. But 90% of my time is spent on the day-to-day agronomy of our operations.
And you're from Redcliffs?
Originally, I was born and bred in Redcliffs, yeah. So I grew up on a wine grape property just outside of Redcliffs. Spent all my schooling in Redcliffs and in Mildura. Then I went off to Melbourne for a few years, did some tertiary studies over there, and started my career in agronomy in Robinvale for a while before finding myself right back home in Redcliffs, which I never intended on doing, but here we are.
What was it like studying in the big city for like something that you would, in an agricultural field, just to come back and do the work in an agricultural community?
Funnily enough, I actually studied civil engineering while I was in Melbourne. I never intended on really getting into this field, and came back and ended up doing agronomy by correspondence.
Oh, wow.
After the fact with it. So it's been a series of fortunate events that have led me to where I am today. But it certainly wasn't my plan after leaving my final exam in Year 12.
Yeah, wow. It sounds like quite a journey. You've landed the role with Fresh Produce Group, who have over 700 hectares of grapes and citrus in the Sunraysia area. What would you say is your specialty in your role?
I was employed primarily as a table grape agronomist for Fresh Produce Group. I'd spent the 5 years prior to that in Robinvale consulting on table grapes there, and the operations that Fresh Produce Group came to me about were the table grape operations here, and we have around 400 hectares here, and we've got another 300 or so over in Western Australia.
Oh wow!
So the role was predominantly in that table grape sphere, and at that time, Fresh Produce Group had purchased Tumut Grove, which is a fairly well-known orchard and packhouse in the Calignan area, South Mildura, and it was their first venture into farming citrus. They'd been marketing citrus for quite some time, but they hadn't been into the farming of it. So it was a new experience for all of us, really. So we sort of just dived in head first, and we've learned a lot over the last 5 years.
Yeah.
In that role, and we've since purchased another citrus property as well, just up the road, which has sort of doubled our land ownings in this area here, and we'll continue to invest quite strongly in this field. But I certainly did not come into Fresh Produce Group with a citrus experience background.
And I saw that you were recently on the cover of Vine magazine, which was a really good article and really good pictures. What is evidence-based farming?
Yeah, I mean, that's been our motto for a while around evidence-based farming, and as everyone in this industry will attest to, or everyone in every farming industry will be able to attest to now, it's getting harder and harder to be able to meet the demands of the consumer as well as our rising cost of production. So we can no longer just wing it, as it were.
Yeah.
We need to be making smart decisions around the investments that we're putting in, and the investments that we're putting in are substantial. They cost a lot to run a farm these days. So everything that we are doing is around evidence-based decision-making, and as such, evidence-based farming.
Yeah. Diving into the USA trip, which you went to in May, I'm assuming it was your first time in America. I don't know. What made you put your hand up to go on this study tour?
It wasn't my first time in the United States with this background. Fortunately, the company that I work for, Fresh Produce Group, we import and export a lot of fruit, but we import a lot of the off-season table grapes and citrus from California. So I've been fortunate enough to be exposed to the California side of things on a number of times with Fresh Produce Group on both the citrus and the table grapes side of things, but I'd never really been exposed to any of the biosecurity issues that they may be facing over there. We were obviously over there looking at predominantly table grape production and some citrus production as well, but more so you know, with the context of importing it into Australia, we never really dived into these issues that the industry are facing, and I'd certainly never been to Florida. So you know, the reasons that we wanted to go on this trip with it was because we hadn't, you know, had any exposure to any of these potential biosecurity threats, and Australia has a lot of potential biosecurity threats knocking at our door that fortunately haven't hit our commercial production areas yet, or if they have, like citrus canker did, we've managed to successfully eradicate it. So for me, it was a chance to learn about these exotic threats and how to identify them and how to react should we ever unfortunately find ourselves in a situation where these pests and diseases of concern do hit our production areas.
Well said. What do you think was the most impactful things you learnt or experienced on this trip? Was a trip what you expected? Were there some surprises that you learnt that you didn't think you would learn, you know?
I suppose I went into it not really knowing what to expect. I knew that we would obviously be talking about citrus canker and about Huanglong Bing and you know, the Asian citrus psyllid and these sort of things, but I certainly wasn't prepared for what I was exposed to or what we learned while we were there. I mean, everyone who grows citrus has probably heard of HLB or citrus greening at the very least, but it wasn't until we sort of went there and visited the severity of the impact of it really surprised me. The destruction it's had, particularly in Florida. It really surprised me immensely, and that was when it really sunk in about how serious these issues can be.
It would have been pretty, tough almost just to witness some of that stuff that's going on there.
I think I can attest for everyone that was on that trip as well. Driving through particularly Florida, which anyone who has ever been exposed to the citrus industry knew what a juggernaut of an industry Florida was, particularly for their grapefruit and even more so their juicing industry. Florida Fresh, and there was such a correlation between orange juice and Florida for so many years.
Yeah.
And driving through these areas now and just seeing abandoned farms and just these thousands upon thousands and thousands of acres of abandoned orchards or orchards that have been pulled out, it's gone. And, it was really quite eerie for us as producers that hadn't been exposed to this before, just seeing exactly what had happened to this industry in a relatively short amount of time.
In your line of work, there's a reliance on data and evidence, making the unpredictability of farming a bit more predictable. What kind of technology or ag tech did you see in America being used to forecast these exotic pests?
I think with stuff like HLB, you see a deterioration in the plant immediately. So I think that there is so much ag tech out there now which can, whether it be by drones or planes or satellite imagery, can identify trees that are underperforming or are deteriorating in some way, shape or form. I think these sort of instruments will be pivotal in able to identify potential areas of outbreak. It could be for any other reason that a tree is deteriorating, but it at least will allow you to go and have a point and figure out why it is deteriorating. And, Lord forbid it is because of HLB.
Yeah.
So there are certainly tools and instruments in place now to be able to streamline these identification methods, particularly on very large orchards.
How have nurseries in California and Florida adapted to producing plants with these exotic pests and diseases?
Yeah, look, the nursery industry wasn't something I had really considered going into this trip, but the nurseries have certainly had huge impacts from the incursion of both citrus canker, but more importantly of HLB. The Clean Budwood program, which is now mandatory for citrus propagation in the United States, has certainly been pivotal in limiting the spread of HLB throughout regions currently not yet impacted by HLB. That was something I had significantly underestimated. There has been a push in Australia from certain bodies to get this program up and running, and I never really understood the importance of it with it. But furthermore from that, nurseries have had to invest huge amounts of money into certifying their nurseries or getting up to standard into the new age of citrus propagation in the United States now. So a lot of these structures have now had to, a lot of these nurseries have had to put up insect exclusion housing for production.
Yeah.
They've got to go through regular budwood testing for HLB and for other diseases. And the way the nurseries operate in a day-to-day business means that the costs have increased many, many times over and for them. And as a result, we have seen the amount of citrus nurseries in the United States really reduce.
Yeah.
Those that either are not willing or could not put up with these new cost incursions. And unfortunately, all of those costs have had to be passed on with the cost of purchasing a new tree.
Yeah.
So walking through and visiting these nursery operations over there, it really sank in about just how easily stuff like citrus canker and HLB can be transmitted.
Yeah.
And the importance of having to put in these sort of, from an outsider's point of view looking in, extreme measures.
Yeah, absolutely.
But without those measures, we may be seeing California in the same sort of situation that Florida is very unfortunately in.
It's like, you sometimes think of pest and disease a little bit about the health of the tree and the end result of the fruit. But, like you said, like even the cost of growing the plant itself, like before you've even planted it into the ground, is becoming more expensive. Like everything, it doesn't just impact the tree itself. It's the whole cycle of the nursery and the whole bringing together of the whole production, I suppose, from seed to fruit.
Well, that's exactly right. And I mean, I did some rough costings with some of the nursery operators over there. If I was to say to any business operator over there that overnight I'm going to double one of your costs, that'd be an extreme strain on a lot of businesses. But that's the exact situation that the nursery industry has faced. So upon calculating it out, the cost of purchasing a new tree for commercial production, so I'm talking about in the thousands, is nearly double what we comfortably want to pay for a tree for commercial production here in Australia right now.
Yeah.
So if we were to hit any Australian operation right now with having to say that the cost of your trees is going to nearly double, it'd be a very hard cost to stomach.
Absolutely. Are there any other differences you picked up when it comes to like the cost of doing business, in America?
Yeah, I mean, all throughout a citrus vertical. So if we look at where a citrus tree starts life as a seed through to the rootstock, through to the grafting and into the field, and finally bearing fruit and harvesting that fruit, then packing that fruit and exporting that fruit, every single step along that way has been impacted by canker and particularly by HLB. So even in California, where it is not, HLB is not endemic, they're having to tarp all of their loads of fruit to be able to move from field to pack house. And there's now restriction zones about where fruit can be moved. The amount of sprays and tree husbandry costs that have had to be put in place has sent the cost of production of citrus phenomenally higher than what it ever used to be. And in particularly in Florida, where for such a long time they enjoyed an industry where it was fairly low input. Now all of a sudden they're having to spray 5, 6, 7 times more than they ever did before. They're having to put out a lot more chemical than they ever did have before. All of this in Florida, coupled up with the fact that yields are reducing, and it's really hard to achieve a quality piece of fruit there now. So every part of the production has increased in costs in some way. They're now talking about having to fumigate loads from field to pack house, which all takes time, and you have to pay another party then to come in and fumigate loads and all this sort of stuff. So while that hasn't necessarily been mandated just yet, these guys are continuing to potentially face increasing costs as a result of this outbreak.
How does that make you feel, like knowing that, like, and seeing that?
Obviously, it's extremely concerning. I mean, our costs of production in Australia right now, there is no grower out there that will say that they are very comfortable with the costs of production as they are high. And, the value of fruit is not increasing at the same rate that the value of our costs are.
Yeah.
So if we're to face and to stomach having to deal with these sort of costs in the future, then we certainly need to be able to forward plan and future-proof ourselves to remain economically sustainable and viable as an industry. I'm not saying that in a doom and gloom kind of way. It's just these are the sort of things that need to be considered and anticipated, and more importantly, so making sure that we don't underestimate the impact that some of these biosecurity risks can have in our industry.
Having learnt everything that you've learnt and seen everything that you've seen, like, what are your steps going forward?
As I mentioned before, I can certainly see the benefit now in a clean budwood program within Australia. I was initially sceptical about that within Australia, but after seeing what I've seen and witnessed firsthand, I will be one of the biggest advocates for that moving forwards. And it will be controversial. There'll be many producers out there that won't be happy with that being put in place. But the alternative is that we end up putting our entire industry at risk.
Yeah.
I think another huge part of what we as an industry inclusive of government bodies need to be focusing on is education and awareness of this situation. So education for industry will be critical in ensuring action can be taken in the possibility of an incursion. It would be really hard to argue with industry that we need to take arguably drastic actions if they do not understand the severity of this situation.
Yeah, you can't really, if you don't know about a threat that's coming, how are you meant to prepare for it, and that's also
Precisely.
becoming aware and learning about it.
So, for me, I've been able to educate our own business and really drive home the importance of it in our own business, and our third-party suppliers as well. But it's going to be just as critical to get it out to broader industry as well. I mean, we have citrus producers all over the country. So what we're doing here in one small part of the country won't necessarily be enough. We need to, as an industry, make sure that the whole industry is aware. Furthermore from that, I think the education for the public needs to be considered as well. We've seen in America how the risk of backyard grown citrus and the spread of disease into commercial areas from those situations can be a massive risk to us. So to be able to educate the public on why we have these measures in place and whatever those measures may be. But I think the biggest part about that will be about ensuring that all budwood is sourced from clean budwood programs, and making that available to public as well. One of the biggest risks that we have is people smuggling in dirty budwood. That is potentially where we will see an incursion come from.
You visited some researchers on this trip. In terms of preparing for an incursion, did any I guess I've already asked this question. Did any particular technology or research stick out to you as something that Australia should look into? I guess you've answered that in the budwood scheme.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, I think one of the things that was one of the more exciting and interesting things that we had learnt was a case study out of California when detections of ACP, or the Asian citrus psyllid, and positive HLB positive ACPs were found in the Los Angeles area. An investigation went into place about what beneficial insects may be out there to be able to control these Asian citrus psyllid populations. And there was some fantastic research done, and a beneficial wasp species, the Tamarixia radiata species, was isolated and identified and went through some screening to be able to be brought back to Los Angeles and released. And that proved hugely successful in controlling ACP populations throughout the metropolitan areas. Metropolitan areas is obviously really hard. We can't We can't blanket spray. We can't put any of these chemical options in place. We've seen political backlash in trying to mandate removal of citrus trees from people's backyards. So this was a really interesting case study in which it avoided all of those other potentially nasty situations, but still rather successfully knocked down the populations of ACP through there. So I think that is a control measure that we should be investigating further. Not necessarily Tamarixia, it may not work within Australia, but what possibilities would we have with our climates and our subclimates? We have tropical and subtropical and arid areas of production as well. So is there any of these species within the world anywhere that would be a viable option?
Yeah.
Should we ever have an incursion or an outbreak of ACP?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the idea of bugs fighting off bugs. It's probably every ant movie you've ever seen.
Exactly right. And there'll be plenty of producers out there that will not necessarily yet believe in the bugs for bugs situation, using bugs to fight off bad bugs. But the case study in California is something that should be put within the spotlight for our industry as well. This has worked and arguably has potentially saved the Californian industry from further outbreaks.
If there was one thing Australia could learn from American growers' experiences, what would it be? The American industry is quite large scale compared to Australia. Would you see any tools transferable to smaller businesses in Australia?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, everything is bigger in America, right? But it's all economies of scale. So the number one thing that stood out between growers and producers in California, and more importantly in Florida as well, is do not underestimate the impact of Huang Longbing.
Yeah.
Do not underestimate it for a second. Then secondly, have a plan and do not wait to act on it.
Yeah.
We need to be preemptive.
Yeah.
We need to be proactive. We cannot be reactive. That is exactly what happened in Florida and the situation they're in now. Then the third thing that was probably, of interest and stood out was, as a backup plan, identify varieties of citrus that may be tolerant to HLB or canker or whatever exotic pest that we're talking about. As a backup plan, should we ever find ourselves in a situation where these pests have become endemic? That's exactly the situation that Florida are in now. They've nearly raised the white flag and are now saying, let's just find a way to live with this. And if there are varieties that are tolerant to this HLB I'm referring to right now, then let's identify them and start, looking at commercially producing these.
And I imagine that's frustrating it would have been frustrating for industry to hear that. And it might have taken time for industry to come to that conclusion, let's stop trying to eradicate, let's start trying to live with it. It'd be a tough decision to go ahead with.
I think we need to have a look at the history of the politics that played out, particularly in Florida as well. Prior to the arrival of HLB, particularly in Florida, was where they had the canker incursion. And they put a huge effort into eradicating canker. And unfortunately, it wasn't successful. But there was a lot of backlash and almost exhaustion from growers and from public at the actions, admittedly probably extreme actions that were put in place to try and eradicate canker. That when HLB arrived, they basically said, we are not going to try and eradicate this. We have been through this. We are not going to try and eradicate it. And that ended up being hugely detrimental. So the learning from that history as well is probably important. Should we ever find ourselves in a situation here of any incursion of any sorts?
Well, yeah, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Is there anything else you want to say or comment on about your experiences on the USA trip, or just anything random that you've got on mind at the moment?
No, look, I'd like to thank Citrus Australia and Biosecurity Australia an enormous amount for exposing us to this. And again, to all those listening out there in this industry, please do not underestimate the impact that some of these biosecurity risks can have we need to be really strong and forceful almost about ensuring that our industry is educated about this. But thanks once again to Biosecurity Australia and Citrus Australia in turn for supporting us on this trip.
No, thank you for coming and thank you for speaking to us today. I know it's a kind of busy season time for everyone, and yeah, unless it's raining, of course.
No, not a problem at all. Thank you very much, Candy.
Joining us on the podcast today is Craig Estens. How are you, Craig?
Good, thanks, Gabby. Thanks for having me contribute to the show.
Yeah, no worries. Happy to have you. Where are you right now in the world of Australia?
I'm situated at Abbotsleigh Citrus. Abbotsleigh is located about 50 k's inland from Bundaberg in the central Burnett.
Have you always been in the Bundaberg region? Is that where you were born and bred?
No, I was brought up in a small town, near a small town, on a sheep and cattle and dryland cropping farm near a small town called Toorawina in central West New South Wales. And then I spent a fair bit of time in Moree working across cotton and processing oranges.
Oh, wow. So I'm from a sheep farm, so that's good to know. And you were on a cotton farm as well, weren't you?
Yeah, so I was working with my cousin Dick Estens on his farm just out of Moree. So I learnt a lot, from him working underneath Dick. I worked with them for about 8 years, and that's sort of where I started in the citrus industry. So he was processing oranges primarily for the juice industry.
Ah, okay, cool. And then in 2021, you joined Nutrano and became their farm manager.
Yes, Gabby. I was looking at broadening my experience in the citrus industry, and I saw a job come up in the central Burnett, and I knew of the farm and the previous owner, Michael McMahon. And, so I came up and had a bit of a look at the farm, and, it's a great spot, and thought, what a better place to put my hands into the table fruit side of the industry.
So the reason you're here today is to talk about the trip in May, the biosecurity tour in the US. Why did you put your hand up to go on the study tour?
Gabby, the opportunity came from my general manager, Tanya Chapman. After 10 years in the citrus industry and having talked to several people over the years that have visited Florida, their comments, along with the knowledge I'd gained from Citrus Australia events over the years, gave me an understanding that this was the single biggest threat to our industry. And to develop and focus my future within the industry, to experience firsthand the impact that the Asian citrus psyllid, or ACP, and Gualong Bing, HLB, would have on our shores, and the things that the Americans had learnt and the preventative measures that we could put in place, not only from a farm level, but from industry as a whole.
And this is your first time going to America to look at anything like this?
Not in ag, but I did spend a bit of time over there doing a trade apprenticeship. So I did a bit of travelling, mostly in Canada.
Oh, wow. That's really cool that you got to do that.
Yeah, so I hadn't seen much of the States, but it was a very interesting trip.
We'll do an episode one day where we'll just talk about places growers have visited, and we can do a whole, I don't know what we'll call that episode. We'll just call it Getaway or...
Yeah.
So can you briefly explain where you went on the tour and what types of people you met and visited?
Yes, Gabby. Our team leader and tour guide, Jess Lai, the biosecurity officer at Citrus Australia, put together an amazing itinerary with some very informative speakers. We landed in California and visited 2 labs in Riverside that were cleaning planting material for propagation. The way they did this was via shoot tip grafting, process I'd never seen before. But this involved taking the very tip of a new shoot from a budwood stick and then grafting this shoot into a germinated stem of a seedling under microscope. The reason that they did this was because the virus or disease is translocated through the vascular system of the plant. In the very tip of the shoot, there's no vascular system, but the DNA of the plant remains. So they can guarantee clean material for propagation. The success rate of the shoot tip graft is as low as about 10%. So it becomes a tedious but necessary process. From there, we went and visited Mark Hoddle from the University of Riverside.
Yep.
Mark's a specialist in biological control, and he had a pretty interesting story. He was instrumental in locating a parasite for ACP. And he was able to identify that ACP originated in the Punjab region in Pakistan. He then went about looking for a parasitoid in this region and identified Temorexia as a potential control. He realised that breeding Temorexia, breeding it correctly, was the key to the success of the control. I think he had to isolate different generations from each other so they didn't interbreed, and it was quite interesting, his talk. But after testing the parasitoid on the native population and getting approval for release in California, the success rate of this biological control measure was able to reduce ACP populations by 70% in Southern California.
Wow.
Yeah, he also had another very interesting talk about a very successful biological control that he implemented into Tahiti to combat the glassy-winged sharpshooter.
Yeah.
The glassy-winged sharpshooter was accidentally brought into Tahiti by plant material into the presidential gardens. And I won't go too far about it, but it's a great case study if you look it up. But this research shows the positive impact that these control measures can have.
Yeah.
He also reiterated that these control measures take a lot of time to get approval after testing on native populations when introducing into a new country. So, this got us thinking, and we're, as a team, we'd sit down on an afternoon and have a bit of a debrief. But, food for thought, is this something as an industry we could already have approval for release if we saw an incursion of ACP to have the testing already completed on native populations? Because this could almost buy us 2 years worth of waiting for approvals and could become an instant tool that could help in the event of an incursion.
Yeah.
So, that was all very, very interesting.
Yeah, it's almost a bit like, how we've already got the tolerant root stocks here before,
That's right. I mean, the Americans have been doing a lot of work over the last probably 20 years on this. So it's, they've got a lot of resources and funds that we don't necessarily have. So it's, it's interesting to watch what they're doing.
Yeah. And high school, we had like a boxer or a fighter. I'm not sure which one he was, come talk to us for like inspiration. And his quote was, if you fail to prepare, prepare to fail. And in biosecurity, that just doesn't... that doesn't really pay off at all. You need to be prepared.
That's right. And that was the biggest take-home message from nearly everyone we spoke to, basically said you need to be proactive about this. Unfortunately, Florida really had the problem, much before they saw the effects. So,
can you tell us about some of the challenges that farms were dealing with because of exotic pests and disease?
Yeah, we visited several. So first off, we were in California. We visited the Central Valley near Bakersfield, the biggest citrus growing region in California. We were blown away by the scale of the operation at Wonderful Citrus, and we met with Etienne Rabe, who gave us an insight into the challenges and the extra costs associated with growing and packing citrus in a region with HLB at the doorstep. Some of the costs, increased costs were they were tarping trucks and fumigating fruit bins prior to transporting them from farms to pack sheds. This became, a necessity. They're actually auditing and making sure this was abided by. The added cost for producers, this increased cost by about $75 American per hectare, and then levies paid by producers have increased about $300 a hectare to help risk-based surveillance in LA. We then visited Florida, and we were just, what a shock we were in for. HLB has infested 95% of trees in Florida, and most orchards were either abandoned or cleared and used for pasture. We spoke with one grower, told us that he was using individual full cover nets on his trees for the first 3 years of growth to keep the plant from infection. And it was a cost of about $20 a plant for these nets.
Yeah.
And then, which is about twice the cost of a traditional planting. Once removed in year 3, it took less than 30 days before 100% of the plants were infected with HLB.
Yeah.
So it was just absolutely rampant.
Yeah.
They were then given a trunk injection of I struggle to read this one, but oxytrexaline, and this came at a cost of about $400 to $600 an acre. This helps the tree slow the infection, but at significant cost. But it wasn't the silver bullet. It just slowed the infection and enabled the tree to get about year 7. So it gave the tree pretty good growth until year 7, and then they started seeing trees to decline until they were removed and unproductive by about year 10. One grower said that he was going backwards at about $400 a hectare per annum, and he was basically just trying to hold in long enough so that they could come up with a solution.
Yeah.
So that was quite shocking to hear. I think he said that is basically selling down country to keep his foot in the door in case there was a solution. So, that's quite scary. Yeah, I was blown away by the optimism that, once when faced with such adversity of some of these farmers. What's really scary is that Florida have been dealing with this issue for 20 years and they still don't have a solution to the problem. They've had huge resources to fund, research and look for or breed new resistant varieties. One quote I heard that it was like trying to single-handedly find a stop sign that was turned backwards in the USA. So quite a challenge they've got in Florida.
Yeah, it sounds like it had a great impact on being able to see that with your own eyes and everyone else in the group. It's a little bit like watching a movie and finding out it's a true story at the end,
That's right. California was they were still highly productive, and they were managing, to grow citrus, and they seem to be doing well. But Florida is just, it's a completely different story.
What were some of the ways that growers were trying to remain profitable? You've kind of already talked about, how putting the nets over the trees, the extra effort into transporting the fruit. Like, what were growers trying to do remain profitable and sort of future-proof in their business?
Yeah, so using these nets, so the best practice that they were sort of implementing were using nets over these trees, making sure planting material was clean, trunk injections. They were using what they call cups, so citrus underprotective structures. They come with challenges as well. Florida gets a lot of heavy winds and hurricanes come over the coast, so these cup structures from time to time lose their lid. It can be, a week or two before they've got the covers back on these cup structures. So it's a very challenging place to grow citrus. They're planting varieties that are showing some signs of resistance. They're also one grower we spoke to is selling down land and focusing on smaller areas to buy time so that researchers and breeders can come up with solutions. So that's just a few things that they're trying. So,
do you reckon there's a greater relationship between the research industry and the grower side of the industry trying to collaborate and work together?
Yeah, most definitely. There's a lot of researchers over there and guys in labs and, really trying to nut this problem out. The plant breeders, some people in labs trying to find blockers, and that's all a little bit above my head, but there's plenty going on.
What was something that you saw that stuck with you from the trip or made you think different about biosecurity or, about these pests and diseases? Because, we probably talk about HLB and ACP a lot till you go on these trips or see it for yourself or learn about it. It doesn't have the same impact as sort of hearing about it from us.
Yeah, look, one thing that really, from every every speaker, every person we spoke to, everybody basically said that you need to have a proactive approach rather than reactive. This was something expressed from time and time again. Everybody, and one thing that was quite damning was, they're all saying it's not a matter of time, it's when that you'll get an incursion. So,
and how do you think citrus farms would be impacted if HLB were to arrive in Australia?
I believe that Queensland would be impacted severely due to the suitable climate for ACP. I think it would thrive in this climate. We have a similar climate and humidity to Florida, where we have insects. Every orchard that we went into, they were abundant. They were everywhere. It wasn't hard to find one, laying nymphs on laying eggs into trees and stuff. So it's quite rampant. I think it would be very hard to stop ACP from working down the coastline without the natural barriers we see around LA in the Central Valley. The coastline, every town and council garden is loaded with hedges of morea or sweet orange, and this is highly attractive because of the several flushes per year to the ACP. They feed on that new flush, and it's a major host plant. And I think that would play a significant role in the movement of the ACP if we saw an incursion. The final message I would say is that we need to build a proactive approach and develop a plan, educate people about what we can do, and brainstorm ideas to help our industry. Yeah, it's a challenging task.
Definitely. Is there anything else you would like to say or add, or just any general comments about the trip or anything? Actually, you can do a shout out.
I'd like to thank Jessica Light for all the work she put into getting this trip together. There was a lot of research and organising, the accommodation and the times and meeting with these people. So she did an excellent job, and the itinerary was jam-packed, and we can't thank Jessica for all the hard work enough. So that's and I think everybody on the tour thought the same. And the group of people that went as well were from all over Australia. There was one group from every region. So that was quite good, and everybody was engaged and had good opinions and discussions at the end of each day. So that was a really, really worthwhile trip. And I'd like to thank Citrus Australia for getting the funds forward for this trip.
Yeah, you're welcome. No. Thank you so much for that shout out. And thank you for yourself. It takes growers to put their hand up to do these things and say yes and be open to learning and becoming aware of what's going on, not just within the Australian citrus industry, but in the world citrus industry, to make it not better, but just keep it moving forward. And like you said, being proactive is just really essential to going forward. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And I hope you have a good rest of the season, a good rest of the year.
Thanks very much, Gabby. It was been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you again, and see ya.
See ya. Cheers.
Well, thanks for listening to another episode of the Full Bottle Podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening, and we'll show your love and support by sharing the podcast with your friends and family.
Thank you to our guests for breaking away from the busy citrus season to having a talk to us. We can't do the podcast without these guys volunteering their time, so make sure you give them some love as well.
You guys know the drill. Hit subscribe on the podcast if you haven't already, and reach out to us on our social medias for podcast ideas and feedback.
From the orchard, tractor, ute or shed, thanks for tuning in. This project was co-funded by the Plant Health Australia Citrus Levy. The tour was organised through the Citrus Watch program, which is funded by Hort Innovation through the Citrus R&D Levy. To see what other initiatives and actions are being done to protect and prepare industry, head to the biosecurity page on the Citrus Australia website at citrusaustralia.com.au/biosecurity.